Welcome back to History in Lowell. Happy anniversary to us. I'm Maritza, this is Bob. We've been doing this for 7 years now. Happy anniversary, Bob.
I was not gray then.
So my grades have started coming in, and I do blame the state of the world.
The state of the world, yeah. Yep, that's my excuse.
Exactly. Well, it is Black History Month. It's also our birthday month, because we share February as a birthday. It's also Trayvon Martin's birthday month.
Yes.
Which
Same
you share
day
birthday?
As me.
Yes.
I share birthday with Mr. Martin.
Exactly. And we all know Black history is American history, and a lot of what's gone on in the last few years is let's pretend that history is not real. And so here we are in the current state of the world where people are pretending like a lot of these things in the past didn't happen. And that's what we're talking about today, Bob. So kick us off.
Yeah, what's been fascinating for me in the last 3 or 4 months of the political primary season, every once in a while there's been a question of the candidates about the Civil War, which is something that I teach. And I can't always figure out why, in the middle of everything else that's going on, why that's the question. But then when I started thinking about it and listening to people more, I'm hearing the Republican candidates, Democratic candidates have not been asked that question, which actually would be worth asking to see what Biden would say. Some would claim he was alive during the Civil War. But on the other hand, the Republican candidates have, as a general rule, fairly consistently talked about the cause of the Civil War is states' rights. And I've always been bothered by that because it's not true. Seems like every 30 or so years from the end of the Civil War in 1865, we refight the war and come out with the conclusion that the war wasn't about ending slavery and about trying to establish equality for formerly enslaved people. And so that history just gets obliterated, gets erased, and people come up with this odd description of what life was like in the country after the Civil War. And so this semester at UMass Lowell, I'm teaching this history, and it's been fascinating to talk to my students to see what did they get in high school, what do they think about all of this. So that's basically what we're going to talk about today.
Amazing. It really baffles my brain, and I've heard this argument, oh yeah, it was about states' rights. I always put it back, states' rights to do what? And people don't think beyond that. They just want to keep that there. It's like when you say racism is a thing, they're like, well, I'm not racist. It's almost, it's to me, it's the exact same thing. You're trying to separate the cause of all that was going on. So let's dig deep. What's going on today that made you want to do and talk about this topic?
So because in the political debate currently people are relitigating the war, and Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and Trump as well. Well, Trump's thing is there's good people on both sides, and so whatever the hell that means. But Haley and DeSantis in the primary season that we're in the midst of both said that slavery was not the cause of the Civil War. And then when they were pushed, and then on the day after, and then the day after they said it, they got more blowback from political pundits and whatnot. Then they said, well, that's not really what I meant. You misunderstood what I was saying.
Nikki Haley talked about her black friends, right?
Right, and that I'm from South Carolina. I mean, what's interesting is that she knows, what troubles me is that these characters all know better. Ron DeSantis has a Harvard degree, right? But he pretends he's like whatever, right? I mean, it makes me wonder about a Harvard degree, but that's a whole other show. But on the other hand, a few years ago, a white shooter went into a black church in South Carolina when Haley was governor of South Carolina and killed many people and wounded others in that church. And her reaction was to move through the state legislature a bill to take down the Confederate flag. which shouldn't have been flying over the Capitol anyway, but which was. And so, to her credit, I mean, it should have happened sooner. It should have happened before she ever even became governor, but she did do it.
Right.
And she understood that moment and what that moment meant to Black people living in South Carolina and living throughout the South and in the rest of the country. It was symbolism, but it was significant and important. And she did it. And she got a lot of blowback, a lot of criticism.
Right.
And she understood that. So I think that what happened for both of them is they're trying to appeal to a white element of the voting population, especially people that vote in the primary, who somehow have either gotten bad history or forgotten the history that they did get, and they don't want to antagonize them by bringing up the question of race. And we're sort of in a moment now where people are pushing back against anything related to trying to improve race relations, talking about diversity. I mean, everything that happened last month with President of Harvard University, pushing her out of her office, and all of these things are all mushed together.
Oh, yeah.
And what happens is then we get what typically happens. We get whitewashed U.S. history, pun not intended.
Leave it to an election
Yeah.
to stir things up, because it's all bringing me back to 2020 and all of the ways that we were having a racial reckoning, right? And people were actively learning and, actually picking up books, the things that we're always telling them to do. At least it seemed so. And now the more people are learning, the more, as the years have gone on, they don't like it.
Yeah, there was a moment. And then there was an editorial in the New York Times the other day. I forget I might have been Charles Blow, I think that's his name. He said, he in there sort of went through this history and said that at each moment where there's progress on civil rights, then within a couple of years of that progress being made, there's a backlash. And he went through this period of the 1870s, right after the Civil War, 1890s, early 1900s, 1960s, with the sort of rise of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and then the backlash there with Richard Nixon in the White House and then Ronald Reagan. And he said we're in that moment again now after the kind of George Floyd moment of thinking about and having these conversations. People now don't want to have anything to do with it and are scrambling off the boat of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I thought was well put. And it also made me again think about, as I'm teaching this, how history. I have a T-shirt that says "Study history so you don't repeat it."
Yeah.
Sadly, it doesn't. In some ways, it doesn't matter. We still do.
Yep. I always find moments like this as somebody who looks at history terrifying, but also hopeful. Because, as you said, if you go through the history, we can see these moments happening, the backlash, but also what comes out of it. So let's go back to what happened right after the Civil War.
So, 1865. The war ends, there's a signing of a treaty, 13th Amendment has been ratified, January of 1865 goes into effect, ends the institution of slavery, 14th Amendment and the 15th Amendment. So there's three powerful statements made. The 14th Amendment establishes birthright citizenship and also establishes theoretically equal rights. The 15th Amendment says the states cannot use race to bar people from voting. And so you have civil rights, and you have freedom, and then civil and political rights. And so in the immediate aftermath, there's a rush to voter registration by formerly enslaved people in the South. The voting rolls in Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana, jump with thousands of formerly enslaved people, men, because women don't benefit from the voting rights part of this, not yet anyway. They sign up and they register to vote. And in the 1868 elections, there are a number of Black people who are elected to the House of Representatives of the United States.
Which they definitely don't teach that in high school.
And also in mayor's offices and state legislatures all over the South. And that's partly because when you think about the economy of the South, you had a handful of white people that owned all the land, and many, many more enslaved people working the land. And once they're free, they outnumber the white folk. And so that presents an interesting political dilemma, and that bears out in 1868, and people see that. And immediately begin to scramble, white people immediately begin to scramble to try to figure out how to put the freedom and voting rights genie back in the bottle, so to speak, and how to quell this uprising of political power. And at the same time, the other thing that happens is there's a huge upsurge in black parents wanting their kids to get an education because it's been illegal to teach black people how to read. And so now there's a rush to establish black schools. There's a whole movement of northern educators to go south and help build school and train teachers. And so there's this real sort of impetus for people to get an education and to vote, understanding that's the way change is going to get made. Right. And again, this reaction sets in with an incredible wave of violence. The 1868 election, thousands of people lose their lives trying to vote, particularly in Mississippi and Louisiana. And then what gets really crazy, and my students were fascinated by this, this was like, they were like, what? They still don't think completely believe me. In 1873, 1874, to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, civil rights, political rights, the federal government still has the army, the Northern Army is still in the South, and they've carved up the South into 5 military districts, each of them with a military force that's there to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments.
Wow.
And this obviously rubs the South the wrong way. And even with that occupying force, there's still all this violence that I mentioned a second ago. So there's a presidential election in 1876. This is when it gets really weird. And the Democratic candidate's a guy named Samuel Tilden. And the Republicans a candidate by the name of Rutherford B. Hayes, right? Tilden wins. Tilden's a Democrat. Tilden wins. He wins the popular vote, and he wins the Electoral College vote. Republicans claim shenanigans. Does this sound familiar? And the Republicans basically say there was voter fraud in Louisiana, in Mississippi, and in Florida.
So eerie when history repeats itself.
And they know it's not true, but they basically control the House and the Senate. Republicans are in the majority in the House and the Senate. So Republicans basically set up a commission to investigate illegalities of the election and to try to create a do-over. Alternative electors are sent to Congress to certify this is how the state votes turned out. Democratic Party, this is the rub here. The Democrats could fight it, and it could take a long time. We might not get actual transfer of power within the allocated time, perhaps. The Democrats and the Republicans now make a backroom deal. The Democrats agree to let Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, be president if the Republicans agree to end Reconstruction by pulling the federal troops out of the South that had been enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments, and that's what happens.
No way.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
And it shows you, I mean, I ask my students, like, what do you think that means? And eventually we get there and they say, so they cared less about the White House than reinforcing white supremacy. And then I say, thank you, yes, that's exactly what they did. It meant more to them to be able to return the social structure of the South as close to what it was during slavery days as they could possibly get it, without the ability to actually reinstitute the institution of slavery. And so that's what happened. So the 1876 election ends Reconstruction, and it's at that point then that all the southern states began to create laws, and they're very clever. because the Voting Rights Amendment says you can't discriminate on the basis of race. So what they do is they pass state laws that say, one of them basically says you have to pay a tax to vote. And if you show up, if you're a black person and you show up to vote, to register to vote, and it's 1876 now, or after when these laws have been put in place, they say, well, retroactively, you have to pay this tax back to 1865.
No.
Because you should have been registered to vote back then, and so retroactively, so this is one of the things that they do, and they say it's not on the basis of race. The other thing they'll do is create literacy tests. And so if you're an older person in the South and you haven't learned how to read, you can't pass a literacy test.
Just constantly weaponizing literacy.
Right. And then they also pass, like they also give you like almost like a SAT kind of a test, but they create these really weird questions and things that you can't. I actually have my students do the tests and they can't pass them.
Oh my gosh.
Because of the way they're worded, you can't even understand sometimes the questions that they use.
Yeah.
And then the other one that they use, which some people may have heard of, they have this thing called the grandfather clause. You can vote if your grandfather could vote. But if somebody's 20 and they go to register to vote, their grandfather who's 60 in 1880 wasn't voting in the 1840s and 1850s and wasn't voting. So, okay, well, and so they're even okay with disqualifying poor white voters who might not be able to pay the tax.
Yeah.
Because that's a small number of people versus disqualifying thousands of potential black voters. So in Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia, North and South Carolina, Florida, you know, where there might have been 100,000, 125,000, 150,000 people on the voting rolls, now there's 1,000 or 1,200. The other thing that they do is if you're black and you go to register, well, anybody, but it hurts black people the most, they put your name in the paper that you registered to vote. And the idea is that they're going to intimidate you because your employer will fire you if you've registered to vote, if you're black.
What?
And so by putting your name in the paper, that's a threat, that's an intimidation. Now people know you registered to vote. Who do you think you are?
Wow.
And you get fired. And so there's a pattern of that sort of discrimination as well.
Oh
so when people, so what's interesting to me about this is when you think about this history, it helps us to understand better why people, why in the 50s and 60s, the civil rights movement was so adamant about registering people to vote and voting, because people had been so disqualified for such a long time, and the history of that in the black community was personal, right? Up here in New England, whatever. I mean, it could have happened. People could, obviously there's discrimination here. I'm not saying there isn't, but voting, but not so widespread with respect to voting. And so sometimes you can think, well, why do people care so much? Like, why are people getting so upset? It's just an ID. Well, yeah, you don't have a family history. You don't have that legacy of that kind of violence perpetrated on your great-grandfather because he wanted to vote, or your great-grandmother because she wanted to find a job.
Right.
And so, I mean, so we get that. So things improve a little bit, 1890s, early 1900s, but things aren't great. Federal government's beginning to be desegregated, jobs in Washington, D.C., by Republican presidents, particularly Theodore Roosevelt, but also William Howard Taft. Woodrow Wilson becomes president, Democrat, resegregates the entire federal government. And Wilson's a Democrat. Wilson is the former president of Princeton before he gets to be president.
Of course.
And he basically resegregates Washington, D.C. The Birth of a Nation, this incredibly horrific racist film that shows Reconstruction in a horrible light, and like it basically shows it as black people exacting violence and revenge on white people, and actually was the other way around. He shows The Birth of a Nation in the White House. Oh my goodness. Gives it the White House seal of approval, all of this, and so again a backlash that culminates in what historians call the Red Summer of 1919, which at the end of the First World War, around the country in most big cities, there's a series of incredibly violent racist attacks on black communities. Most famously, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Right.
And Tulsa, Oklahoma was where people talk about Black Wall Street.
Yeah.
And the destruction of one of these really wealthy enclaves of black people who have done really well because the oil industry is in Oklahoma, and they've been fortunate enough to have some land and whatever, and where oil is discovered, and they're doing really well, and basically their community gets wiped out, just
decimated.
Erased from the planet. I have a good friend who teaches at the university, who grew up in Tulsa, and was never taught this in the Tulsa schools.
Well, I mean, I'm not really surprised, but not even by word of mouth. Like,
No.
families didn't even pass these stories on.
Not white families. I'm
Not
sure
white
black
families.
families did.
I mean, you'd think that somebody would brag. Like,
I'm also in this semester using this book. There's a new film out, Murders in Osage County. Anyway, it's from a book, and the book is about murders of Native Americans in
Right.
Tulsa. These two things are happening at the same time.
I didn't realize it was in Tulsa.
Yeah,
Is it the Killers of the Flower Moon?
Killers of the Flower Moon, yeah.
Oh my gosh. Oh goodness. Well,
that's
I have
it.
the book at home, so.
And so my students are reading that right now.
Wow.
I'm in my U.S. history class, and the same person who grew up in that area didn't
Didn't know about that either.
No.
Of course not.
knows about it now, but
Yeah.
like when I talked to her about it, she said as a kid.
Oh my goodness.
This was just put under the table. And so again, it ends up that we get this weird dynamic again, where now we're talking about slavery again. Ron DeSantis said a few months ago, you probably remember, for sure you remember this, he talked about how slavery wasn't so bad because people learned some skills.
Yeah, it was like a trade, right?
Yeah, people got a trade, so it really wasn't that bad, right?
Oh my goodness.
But again, it's that kind of I don't know. And then like last week, Florida passed this law to like in Florida public colleges and universities, a sociology class met a certain requirement, like a social sciences requirement, to get a degree at all these public colleges and universities, and the legislature said no more. You're going to take and this is what's weird to me. They said you're going to take a factual history course, and I'm like screaming, what the hell? Like, what's a factual? It's a history course. It has to be factual.
It has to be factual.
What do you mean a factual? What's a factual history course?
Oh my gosh.
But yeah. So 1876 with this election, the push has been to sort of say, haven't we done? The argument is, haven't we done enough? Like we've done enough to deal with this race question in America between the end of the Civil War
Still saying
and
that.
whatever, and so it's great. It's time to put it behind us. And can't we all come together? And can't we all be happy again? And
Make America great again, Bob?
yeah. And so this is Frederick Douglass in response. The assumption that the cause of the Negro is a dead issue now is delusion, utter delusion. For the moment, he may be buried under the dust and rubbish of endless discussion concerning civil service reform, tariff, free trade, labor and capital, but our Lazarus is not dead. He only sleeps. And he's saying, like all you people that think everybody's equal now and everything's all good, yeah, it's not. And just because you say it is, doesn't mean it is.
It's not.
But this is where I think that's where we're at again with sort of the contemporary question of how do we deal with these questions of civil rights, voting rights. I mean, we see in Lowell that it took a voting rights a lawsuit, just a few years ago to try to do a better job of creating a more equal, more fair system of voting in the city of Lowell. We just saw 3 weeks ago in Lowell them hire a new superintendent of schools without ever doing a search.
Yep.
Now, the person they picked could be I have no idea. I know that, I forget his name, but I know of this person. Could be absolute best person in the world for the job, but how do we know that?
Exactly. Where is the system, right, that's supposed to work for all of us?
Yeah, I mean,
right?
they basically go to a meeting and 5 people in the meeting decide, okay, tonight we're going to vote for it. We're going to take the interim superintendent and make this person the permanent superintendent. And by, a split vote, by 1 vote, it's done.
And wasn't there like a whole push a couple of years ago for more transparent
Yes.
hiring practices
Yes.
with the city and the schools?
Yes, there was. And there's diversity, equity, and inclusion training being done at City Hall, where people are going and taking courses and getting certificates on the fact that they understand these issues. And I mean, that just struck me like, whoa, that's like Lowell of like 80 years ago or 70 years ago. How do you do that? How's that okay? Like if it was George Floyd time, we would have had to do that, but well, George Floyd time is over.
It's over, yeah.
Trayvon Martin time is over.
Oh
that
my
happened quite a
gosh.
few years ago. We don't have to think about that anymore. We're good. We can just put this person in as superintendent. It's like, wait, like what are we doing?
What are we doing?
Yeah.
People, when we say study history so that we don't repeat it, that's what we mean.
Yeah.
And then I also just really quickly, because we are running out of time, you talked about how all of these things impacted low-income white folks. The building of schools, when Black folks started building schools in rural communities, other people who lived in those rural communities also benefited from that. Once those schools got closed, guess who else couldn't go to school? Those poor white kids who were there.
Yeah.
When you take away literacy, when you take away the voting rights that impact those folks too, all of this also disenfranchises white folks.
Yep.
And it just blows my mind, but it's not really mind-blowing because we know that literacy is important, comprehension skills are important, critical thinking is important. This impacts everybody.
Right, and when we were as concerned as we were, and rightly so, about what COVID and Zoom did to kids' learning abilities, then think what happens when there's no school, period. Because there wasn't Zoom in the 1870s and the 1880s, and there wasn't Zoom in the 1950s. In the 1950s, schools were closed so that they don't have to enforce Brown v. Board of Education, which meant that public education in the country had to desegregate. Rather than do that, in many white communities, you just closed the public schools. If you were wealthy, you could send your kid to a private school or a church school, but if you were working class and white and couldn't afford it, your kids didn't go to school either. But that was okay because basically people were appealing to, this kind of, we white people are all in this together.
Mm-hmm. But you're not them. Don't worry about it. It's okay. You'll be fine. You're not them.
Right.
And that's what's happening again.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's sickening to think, but
here we are.
With every great crisis, people rise up. We find community. We are out there. We're doing what we can to educate folks and educate ourselves. We're doing what we can out in the community to educate folks. There is always hope because Bob and I are sitting here together, a white man and a Black woman. And
an old white man.
And people are asking to touch his hair, not mine these days. So maybe some DEI training is working somewhere. I don't know. But there's some kind of hope. And I hope that you all educate yourselves before you go out there and vote. I know that everybody says, oh, voting's not the end all be all, and it's not. So get involved locally, get involved with young people, and educate yourself. It's needed right now. We need to fight. Thank you, Bob. And thank you all for tuning in. This has been History in Lowell. Oh, man.